So here's a breakdown of a few of the types of cheating that people have seen in the Warhammer 40k community in the past. Let's talk foul play on the tabletops, including asking some cheaters themselves what they've done in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd revisit the thorny topic of Warhammer 40k cheating, do a bit of an overview of the subject accompanied by some charts and data, and a bit of community polling as to how big of a problem Warhammer cheating is to the community. Cheating in Warhammer I think is always an interesting thing to talk about. It's pretty much always to hear about how some grown men and women are caught misbehaving themselves and playing their toy soldiers wrong, and any ways that they manage to get themselves caught or embarrass themselves. It is kind of easy to get away with this sort of thing in Warhammer just due to the complexity of the game and having lots of interactions and obscure rules interacting all game long. Most people have far from perfect knowledge of all the factions out there. Plus there's a lot of things happening both on and off the table that's hard to keep tabs on all of it, perhaps meaning there's more room than ever for people pushing their luck a bit. Obviously it's a pretty sad state of affairs when people are cheating at a game of model soldiers. Winning is certainly far from the end of the world if you do happen to lose a game or two, and in general I think just about everyone would really want to win a game because they actually played well or the dice happened to go their way. It just seems like a bit of a hollow victory if someone's cheating on the table. Certainly something that people tend to band together whenever they hear about results of that. It's definitely got the chance to harm the enjoyment of others, could really discourage newer players if they feel that people are taking advantage of them, and it probably doesn't really help the people who are cheating that much. Getting a bad reputation and people not wanting to play against you isn't exactly the most fun either. Something that I think is worth mentioning early is cheating versus making accidental mistakes in your favour, which I think is a very big difference in 40k. When I've made things like channel polls or videos like this in the past, a lot of people have said, oh, I accidentally cheated once when I didn't realise that my unit stat was this way, or something similar to that. I'd argue that's not really cheating, that's just making an honest mistake, and if you're doing that sort of thing, you're probably doing things against your favour as well, and just not knowing about it. 40k does have an awful lot of rules and complex interactions, people will definitely get things wrong, and I feel like on the flip side, people are maybe a little bit quick to attribute misplays to malice, as opposed to people just genuinely not understanding their army or being a bit new to the game or something. I think it's definitely important to always give people the benefit of the doubt and not find malice where none exists. In reality, I'd also bear in mind that things aren't always really all that clear cut. I'd say the vast majority of misplays are perhaps a more sort of soft cheating and maybe overlapping with poor sportsmanship to some extent. Say, for example, one player just having a good bias to see all the rules in their favour, maybe any rules mistakes they make happen to benefit them and not the other player, or just maybe measuring things a bit sloppily or optimistically, as they want one unit to be able to do a certain action. You could probably also include aggressively pushing all unclear situations to be ruled your way, or not really playing with fairness or equality, say for example taking generosity in terms of a take-back or something from your opponent, but then not allowing them to do something similar. Overall in Warhammer 40k, I would say that the vast majority of rules errors tend to be just honest mistakes, and then the vast majority of cheating is probably more people just playing very pushily and seeing rules or situations their own way, as opposed to thinking too much and looking at things unbiasedly, as opposed to people maliciously going out to deliberately cheat and have some sort of sad structured plan about everything. With that in mind though, I asked you guys a fair few questions in a channel survey, a few things about the importance of cheating, what sort of things you'd seen out there, and also asking everyone anonymously if they had deliberately cheated within the last year or so, and if so, how. For the most part, people seem to agree that cheating isn't really the biggest issue in most Warhammer 40k games. When asked out of 5 how much they consider it a problem for normal games of Warhammer 40k, most people rate it a 1 out of 5, but still just shy of 40% rate it either 2 or 3, so it definitely is an issue that some people feel like they have to contend with. It definitely doesn't seem like Warhammer 40k is overrun with cheaters or anything to the extent where it impacts every game though. Putting the same thing a slightly different way, I asked people to estimate roughly what percentage of their games tend to feature someone who deliberately cheats, and here's a breakdown of what people voted depending on what sort of percentage of games it comes up in. Maybe a little bit rough and ready with the brackets here, but overall a very rough average seems to be cropping up in around about 7% of games. That'd be roughly 1 in 15. That does feel about right in my experience, to be honest. Though obviously it's kind of subjective, maybe depends on the amount of credibility and benefit of the doubt the person is likely to give their opponent. I also thought it to be interesting enough to ask where people in their experience encountered more cheating, either casual games or in tournaments. I did ask to limit this one to people who regularly play both. Seems that in general in people's experiences does look like it is more likely to happen in tournaments where there's more high stakes and there might be the potential of prizes and things. Compared with what I might have guessed though, it's not really all that big of a difference. Quite a lot of people also ranked equally likely in both areas as well. Doesn't seem that there's at least unanimous agreement that it's more common in events. At least anecdotally, from my experience of tournaments, the vast majority of people do want to play Warhammer 40k fairly. It's definitely not uncommon to meet people who play both very well and also point out all the things you might have forgotten with obscure mission rules that actually means you're scoring more points or something. I've had that happen several times in tournaments when I've forgotten about things that I should have been scoring. And at least anecdotally, I feel like major hard cheating isn't really all that common there either. Generally tends to be more sort of difficult players and just pushing your luck on multiple different fronts for more difficult games, gaining a little bit of movement with sloppy measuring, or getting minor rules advantages that don't quite work that way, or with a bit of plausible deniability that if you call them on any wrong thing, it could have just have been an innocent mistake. Of course, though, in tournaments, people tend to hear about the high-profile cases. Every so often you find a major well-known tournament player gets mass reported by people for doing dodgy stuff, or perhaps surprisingly common getting caught on camera, on stream or on events doing something they shouldn't be, usually prompting all sorts of discussion on Reddit, other social media, and maybe videos made about them. Though personally I'm not the biggest fan of calling out individual players on the channel, generally they tend to be getting enough backlash already I think, plus not really being able to be there at the event and 100% verify what happens. Jumping on hearsay just feels like it could be a little bit scary unless you've checked your sources well. There certainly seem to have been enough things that have blown up well enough on the internet, though, that the evidence seems to be pretty obvious in one player's favour. There's already been a couple of things in 10th edition recently, with an army going 5-0 at a grand tournament and cheating and getting rules wrong at every stage. A kind of hilarious example where a lot of people have talked about weighted Eldari Fate dice attempted to being flushed down a toilet. A few things in the past, like trying to move a tank around with a water bottle, forgetting that they were on stream, and again doing the same on stream and rolling some dice and just calling them completely differently, the other player not being able to see because they rolled them behind terrain. I usually feel like these are kind of entertaining, but perhaps maybe a bit disproportionate in blowing a few bad apples out of proportion. You don't really hear about the games where cheating wasn't an issue, even if I'm sure a fair amount of it goes slightly less well reported. Just to go through a few of the most common types of Warhammer 40k cheating, I thought I'd just ask you guys which you've actually encountered in the wild, as for a bunch of things that I've mentioned in previous videos. Seems like the single most common thing for people to have seen out there at some point in the past was inaccurate movement, people playing sloppy with their models. This one's definitely a very common and easy example of gaining an advantage in Warhammer 40k, just not really quite measuring things quite right. One particularly common thing is to measure the distance and then gain the distance of the model's base or hull, perhaps a fairly common misplay in newer players. I feel like a fair few of this might be more mistakes or just optimistic measuring, with the controlling players just maybe not thinking about things too much unless they're called out on it. Maybe more gaining an advantage on a bit more of a subconscious level as opposed to actually having a plan to do this. It can definitely be a big deal in 40k though. You can gain a massive amount of movement if you just say measure sloppily around ruins and you don't take into account the full distance your model needs to move to clear a wall. Perhaps forgetting the 1-inch exclusion zone around enemy models that you can't go into, or just gaining 1 or 2 inches move each time is a massive movement advantage for an army. It's sometimes a little bit hard to call people out on that if the misplays are only slight as well. It's kind of annoying for the person who's watching it happen, debating whether or not you want to look picky or not by saying yes you moved that an inch too far. Obviously it'd be a whole extra thing to move models around unfairly when your opponent's away from the table or something. Far less common for people to have seen is deliberate slow play. This was reported by around about 20 people. Deliberately dragging out a game of 40k so it doesn't finish and you might gain an advantage by the final win conditions. This tends to be more of an issue for events with round times more so than casual games. I think in general tournament organisers tend to be at least fairly savvy to it, and using chess clocks maybe isn't the worst idea just to at least highlight which player's been taking longer, even if you don't make a massive deal of it or anything. In the past the classic would be have a massive horde army that takes forever to play, move them up to objectives, and then run out of time, so by the end of the game you happen to be all over the objectives and the opponent hasn't had the turns they need to chew through your bodies, so you win by default. I feel like this is generally considered a lot more recognisable and people have much less tolerance for it than they did in the past. I feel like you don't really tend to hear about it quite so much since 9th and 10th edition. Dodgy Dice is another fairly common one. 10 people having said that they'd seen weighted dice out there, at least in one game of 40k that they'd played in. There are far more people reporting deliberate dice manipulation, some sort of sleight of hand type thing, or picking up more dice than they're allowed to. Obviously, weighted dice are about the most unacceptable thing in Warhammer 40k. Interfering with the core random number generation of the game is really quite unpleasant, and going to lead to huge advantages for the player, even if they happen to use them just for a few key rolls. I still don't think that I've ever knowingly seen them used myself before. Though of course every so often you hear stories about people getting caught at a tournament with them, and then banned with extreme prejudice. Far more common, though, is a bit of dice sleight of hand. The classic one is generally picking up more dice than you rolled hit rolls for, maybe just one or two extra in a big pool of rolling. It's hard for your opponent to catch that, particularly if you're rolling things behind terrain or something. And I've definitely seen that sort of thing myself on at least a few occasions. There's all sorts of other ways unscrupulous people could gain more advantages that way, maybe not declaring what you're rolling first and then deciding whether it was an important roll or not after they've actually seen what the dice roll was, and maybe not being very consistent with cocked dice that's on the corner of terrain, only re-rolling if you feel like it's not the result that you wanted. With so many rules in Warhammer 40k, mistakes are going to happen, but it seems that really quite a lot of people have reported playing against opponents that just consistently get rules wrong in their favour, perhaps knowingly misplaying something, or perhaps just if there's a rule they can't quite remember, just seeming to remember it in the way that benefits them most at the time. Again, I feel like this is almost always going to be one that you need to give people the benefit of the doubt on to start with. Most mistakes are going to be innocent. There's lots of mental load going on in games of Warhammer 40k, and most errors are definitely not cheating. Again, though, it does mean that it's one of the areas that's maybe prone to soft cheating, where opponents don't remember something important that would negatively affect them. Whether it's a slightly different statistic, or how their army rule or one of the stratagems works, even if it's slightly subtle to give a big advantage, it's perhaps even easier to get away with things that are kind of debated within Warhammer 40k. Even if there's a definite answer rules as written, you could perhaps plausibly get away with misplaying a bit. Again, I feel like this is the one where if you repeatedly call people out and you keep on finding that they're making errors that favour them the entire way through the game, might mean that there's a bit more chance of that happening deliberately. It's definitely one way you shouldn't be too afraid to ask to check rules just to make sure that things are being played fairly, even if the mistakes are completely innocent. Turning up to the game with an illegal list is another one. This one seems to be a bit more common than some, but less than others, around about 30 to 40 people having reported that. Perhaps the worst thing with this one would be taking extra units and going over your points limit. Again, definitely cheating if done to any major extent, though usually a small extra unit or two within a list that was unlisted is probably unlikely to be noticed unless you're paying super strong attention. They're kind of obvious if you look back in retrospect and see that that unit just wasn't listed on their army list to start with, or if you did bother to check your opponent's list and add up all the points values and see whether or not it actually totals the amount that you're playing. Modelling for advantage is brought up every so often. This one again may be a slightly more of a rare one. 20 people have reported seeing this at some point. Modelling for advantage are generally consider doing things that alter the models from the way that Games Workshop sells them with the intent to gain some sort of advantage in game. Maybe one classic one could be wrong size bases, which might not necessarily be deliberate, but say if you've got a horde mounted on small size bases, that's generally going to be an advantage to them, or a character mounted on an absolutely enormous base so their aura abilities can go further. A lot of the time that definitely wouldn't be deliberate, people just playing with older miniatures that they haven't got round to rebasing yet, or for nice modelling reasons to have a character with really quite a big nice scenic diorama, but in general if you're doing that sort of thing you should probably make efforts to make sure that it's not actually giving you a rules advantage. Another one that I'd seen but not played against in the past is things like modelling certain miniatures in an unusual pose, say trying to reduce their profile so they can't be seen quite as easily. I remember seeing a Wraith Knight modelled kneeling down in older editions, just so you could hide it behind terrain and it had a lower profile. Sometimes you might make miniatures taller as well by modifying them in a cool pose or adding extra bits or details onto them. Again, I feel like for both cases, you just probably need to have a note as to where the normal model's height would be and have something to signify that, and just make sure that it's really well communicated with your opponent pre-game so no one's being confused. In general, tournaments and events tend to have very clear rules on this. I think that this is the sort of thing that maybe isn't quite as big a problem now 40k is a bit more formalised, and people would generally react quite badly if people were trying to do weird things like this. Maybe another thing could be heavily and confusingly not what you see is what you get, so every single unit's modelled something different to what it actually represents. That could be another cause for confusion that might make your opponent do some misplays. Finally, for the last of the examples on my list was miscounting objectives, scoring points wrongly. This one seems to be somewhat misreported, around about 25 people saying that. Again, I feel like this is probably one of the ones that can be done unintentionally, or if someone's just trying to score with the absolute bias, making it absolute rock solid that they don't miss out on a single victory point themselves, but maybe not taking the same amount of care with their opponent's score. As ways of cheating go, I'd say this is probably quite a powerful way to cheat if your opponent isn't really paying attention. 40k is about winning games on points, and a small change could potentially change a win into a loss outright. I say in general, for events and things, it's probably worth keeping track of points yourself as well if you're that bothered about winning. Otherwise, you might really find it hard to catch this at the end of the game. It's often kind of hard to go back in retrospect, and that could lead to errors in itself. Just for a bit of fun, I thought it would be also kind of interesting to ask people directly if they deliberately cheated in a 40k game within the last 12 months. Not a question that you can normally ask people. I did so with a completely anonymised poll, so people could report if they were cheating, and exactly how they chose to do so. Seems that out of the people polled on the community, 15% of people said that yes, they had cheated at some point deliberately in a 40k game within the last 12 months, so around about 1/6 of hobbyists owning up to it. And honestly, I can't help but think that the reality is probably going to be a decent amount more of that, depending on how honest people have been in the poll. And for the people who just aren't really very self-aware and just don't really know that they're doing it by pushing their luck on all sorts of fronts at the same time, I'm sure there's a fair few people in the 84% here. I'll be interested to hear your guys as to whether or not you think that's high or low. Maybe seems roughly in line with the amount that people think they've had people cheat on them in game. Bear in mind that the questions asked were a bit different, which might have been a bit unfortunate on my part. The previous one I asked as to what sort of percentage of games people think that they have cheating in. This is any time within the last 12 months. So a lot of the people who said that they have cheated at some point might have just been on one occasion or something. Perhaps more interestingly, though, was what kind of cheating people did, if so. And it's kind of interesting to see what changes between the cheating that people have reported seeing and what people say that they've done themselves. Seems like the top two categories are kind of in agreement with what was reported and what people who cheated said that they've done. The two main categories that are listed at least were deliberately getting movement wrong. I suppose technically, as per the question, gaining an extra inch or two movement here or there deliberately would still satisfy this if people are being honest. Deliberate dice manipulation was reported by 28 people. I guess picking up an extra dice or calling a dice to be something else other than what you've rolled it. Kind of interesting that deliberately getting rules wrong is reported far less by people doing it intentionally, as opposed to people thinking that they've had people cheat them by doing this. I wonder if that might represent some people thinking that people have got rules wrong intentionally, but actually it was an error. Or perhaps partly might be the people who don't really realise that they're trying to rule everything in their favour, maybe. Another really interesting disparity is a deliberately wrong army list. Looks like only 4 people actually reported doing this deliberately, though it seems like it's a very common thing for people to have reported that they've had done against them. Again, I suppose that might represent people just making honest mistakes. And the least common results were either deliberately misscoring objectives, again something that people seem to think happens far more against them, but people who say that they cheat don't actually say that they do that. Deliberate slowed play seems really rare, with only 2 people saying that they've done that within the last year, and 1 person has admitted to the heinous crime of using weighted dice in Warhammer 40k. Perhaps above all of those, that actually goes out to say that you're deliberately going out to cheat and you've thought about it beforehand. Kind of interesting from the self-reported data at least, though. Overall, I'd say the most interesting takeaways is that getting rules wrong or making a mistake on your army list generally seems like people attribute that to deliberate cheating, where it seems that that's not the case quite as much of the time, and might just be down to error a little bit more than people might think. I must admit I did find this quite a fun one though. Of course, if you do spot someone cheating in Warhammer 40k, then the question becomes how do you go about dealing with it? Do you call the player out and confront them in some way, either politely or impolitely? I feel like at least a fair few people might kind of shy away from that, just from ruining a gaming experience and having a somewhat unwanted, stressful mini confrontation with them, when you're supposed to be having fun and relaxing playing model soldiers. I feel like it really depends on what you want to get out of it, and whether or not reporting or calling them out will actually have any good effect. I feel like a fair few people might just go down the route of just choosing not to play against that person as much, or maybe warning others in the gaming group about them. But I feel like both in a tournament and a casual setting, it could just mean that the other person goes on to keep on causing problems if they're not challenged at some stage, They might mess with other people who they go on to play with at the next round of the tournaments, or they might just be a bit of an unwelcome presence in the gaming group unless people can convince them to change their behaviour, and they're not really going to do that unless they get criticised. I think it's probably usually just worth communicating clearly if they've done something wrong and why you don't like that. For the most time, I think you can still do that in a fairly polite way. Just call them out on each rules error, either before or after the game. And I guess you can potentially report to tournament organisers or talk over the situation with friends as well. If you do so, probably best to be sure that there's actually foul play going on though. I think it would be a dumb situation to be reporting someone where it's actually you who's made the error and you've just not understood what was happening with their army list or something. If you're playing in game against someone who's known to be a problematic player or you think is going to give you a hard time, I feel like there are a fair few actions that you can take to perhaps ensure as much fair play as possible. Starting out, it's worth having a pretty good pre-game discussion, clarify how terrain's going to work, common gotchas in their army list, and things that can act out of turn. Discussing whether you aim to play to intent or not, and communicate things before they happen. Though I must admit, I feel like a fair few times when I've discussed about playing to intent with people, they have radically different ideas as to what that means. Otherwise, if you think you're going to have a difficult game, probably worth keeping track of victory points and command points, and actually making sure that you do that as well as your opponent. Making small errors on those can be absolutely massive, and not taking off a command point when they use a stratagem could be quite a big deal. If there are rules errors or movement errors and things, probably worth speaking up quickly and politely if you think that something's amiss. If you start seeing movement errors earlier in the game, it's probably worth addressing that as early as possible, as otherwise it's just going to keep on happening and might wind you up. Or at least be ready to address it the next time it crops up if it does become a pattern. Letting small things go, like picking up an extra dice or moving a bit further, might make no difference at all, but it could be kind of crucial. I feel like there's been at least a few times in 40k where there's been a borderline decision that I've not really decided to bother challenging, and then it turns out being the crucial inch or two's movement distance between making a charge or not, or getting the last bit of crucial damage needed to down a big vehicle or monster or something. For suspected rules errors, I wouldn't be afraid to ask to see a rule. With 40k being as complex as it is, there's definitely the scope for innocent mistakes, and you can just take a look at a rule to see if it's being played right or not. It's really quite fast to reference things in Index Warhammer 40k, either searching things in the Warhammer app, Warpedia, or in the PDFs quite quickly. And you could even just have a crafty look on your phone while your opponent's doing a few other actions and things. Just have a nose at the way that the rule's working itself, and not have to call out the opponent at all on it. If it does turn out to be accurate, then it gives you all the more reason to trust them. Again, I feel like it's the sort of thing that if you keep on getting rules called in the wrong way, that implies innocent mistakes versus an element of being deliberate. For dice rolls and movements and things, I think it's also worth showing that you're observing the actions that are being taken, particularly with movement distances, or if there's dodgy dice suspected on the other side of the table. It's kind of hard to do anything dodgy with dice if your opponent's literally just taking a proper look at exactly what you're doing, and it makes it very easy to call out if they picked up an extra dice or something. For rules disputes and things, you can also ask for a bit of casual adjudication from people nearby, maybe another knowledgeable player on the next table, or maybe a tournament ref or organiser if they happen to be handy and it's not too much hassle. Overall though, I definitely still stress that cheating in Warhammer 40k is definitely happening in the minority of games, definitely not rampant either in the casual or competitive setting. And while it's worth being aware of as a possibility, it's not worth blowing things out of proportion, and certainly not misinterpreting honest mistakes for someone trying to deliberately deceive you. In any case, hope you've enjoyed a bit of discussion around the subject, and I look forward to hearing all your thoughts and feedback down in the comments. It's definitely an area where most people seem to have one or two interesting stories to tell on the subject, even if it's not something that crops up very much. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular Warhammer 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's how I can keep videos like this coming quite so regularly, with new ones coming out just about every day. If you have been enjoying a lot or just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages like seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.